Chapter 11 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. Recording is in the public domain. New Ideas. It might have been the new dress and hat and sack that helped, or it might have been because Mr. Fred Ainsworth had been coaxed into making a positive promise that he would come around to the church on the square that evening and attend the young people's meeting. Or it might have been that his conscience troubled him for leaving that prayer of poor little Mag's so long unanswered. Whatever the reason, the fact remains that he determined to take Mag Jessup with him to the meeting she so longed for. That is, if Mrs. Perkins's consent could be gained. That was not easy of accomplishment. "Why, I don't know," said Mrs. Perkins, doubtfully, and her face looked more than doubtful. "Oh, I could spare her, of course. It isn't that," spoken loftily. "Mag's services are not so important that it makes very much difference where she is, especially at that hour of the night. But, Mr. Frederick, I have done what I could, so far, to bring her up respectably. I don't believe in little girls being out on the streets evenings, and I've never allowed it. And if you break through my rule and begin with her, who knows where it will end?" "But surely, Mrs. Perkins," said Frederick, and there was a slightly indignant tone to his voice, "a little girl may be allowed to go to church on Sunday evening, provided there is some respectable older person who is willing to go along and take care of her. I did not intend to run away and leave her on the street unprotected." "I suppose not," said Mrs. Perkins, and she tried to make her voice pleasanter. "But the fact is, I have to be very careful. Since I am the only real protector the child has, I feel the responsibility; and if Miss Ordway and you, between you, put notions into her head that cannot be carried out, why, it will be the worse for her as well as for me." Frederick was still indignant. "Let us hope, Mrs. Perkins," said Frederick, "that allowing a child to go to a prayer meeting occasionally, under proper care, will not put any notions into her head that will injure her." Then Mrs. Perkins decided that it would be wise to let Mag Jessup go to prayer meeting. Frederick Ainsworth's family were too valuable patrons to lose, and if Mr. Frederick was a boy who took "notions," it was better to humor him. Therefore it was that Mag Jessup, at 6:30 of that wonderful Sunday evening, arrayed in her new bright dress and hat and sack, with a pair of silk gloves added, that Miss Ordway had discovered among her boxes, and which were not very much too large in the fingers, walked demurely down the street beside Frederick Ainsworth, who was half provoked with himself for doing it, yet could not but be amused over the sparkle in Mag's eyes, and the evident tremor of delight which the little girl was in. "She beats the little girl in the country on the way to the circus," he muttered, remembering his last summer's experience. It cannot be said that he was a very companionable protector. On the plea that they were late, he hurried Mag along almost breathlessly, and said not a dozen words to her until the large plain building at the square was reached. It was true that they were late. As the outer door opened, a burst of song greeted Mag's hungry ears. Always afterwards she remembered the words that welcomed her: "There is music in my soul to day, a carol to my King, And Jesus, listening, can hear the songs I cannot sing." Never had the lonely little girl's heart been so full of song. A new world seemed to be opening to her. Being a very bird for music, before she was fairly seated and an open book had been passed into her hands by a young man who seemed to be watching to perform this service for all newcomers, she had joined in the ringing chorus: "Oh, there's sunshine, blessed sunshine, while the peaceful, happy moments roll. When Jesus shows his smiling face, there is sunshine in my soul." I do not know that it would be possible to tell you how that meeting impressed poor little Mag. If you can think how you would feel if you had never been to a young people's meeting in your life, and when you were about 13 years old had suddenly been introduced into a large, bright room, full even to the very back seats with girls and boys, with flowers on the pulpit and flowers on the piano, and a burst of song from many throats just filling the house, You can, perhaps, imagine something of what it was to Mag Jessup. She wondered afterwards why it was that for a moment her eyes grew so dim that she could hardly see, and a lump seemed to come in her throat. Actually, she was so happy that it almost made her faint. Following the singing came the reading of a single Bible verse, or part of a verse. "And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee." "You all know," said the fair-faced leader, who, to Mag's intense surprise, was a young girl not very much older than herself, "that this is our missionary evening, and our topic is the tenth. I am not going to take much time. I just want to say since I adopted Jacob's motto, and began to give the tenth of everything, that I have a great deal nicer time than I did before. When missionary Sunday came I used always to be anxious. I did not know whether I could spare even a penny to give, and sometimes I had not a penny left; and it used to worry me so that I often wished we did not have missionary Sunday, and I did not have to keep thinking about giving. But now I really like to go to my tenth box and take out a piece of money for the missionary collection, and I know that I haven't got to study over it and decide whether or not I can spare it, because it already belongs. If there were no other reason for giving in this way, than the comfort one can have in it, I should vote for it. Now we want words from those who have tried it, as to how they succeed, and what they think of the plan." Then followed witness after witness, declaring that the plan of giving a tenth to God had been tried by them, and proved helpful, and in every way delightful. One girl especially, with a sweet face and a wonderfully clear voice, interested her hearers. "Most of you know," she said, "that I have very little indeed to give, in money. It isn't often that even a 10-cent piece that I can call my very own, gets into my hands. At first I thought I could not join the 10th Legion on this account. But one day when I was studying my Sunday school lesson, it came to me that one can give time as well as money. So I counted up the hours in my day, and divided them by 10, and I found that I had an hour and a half each day that I ought to give to Jesus. It made me very happy. Only first I could not think of anything I could do that might be called work for him. But when I began to watch and plan, I found that there were ever so many things waiting to be done. Now the hour and a half is not long enough for what I plan to do, and I never was so happy in doing in my life before." Of all the people who listened to words like these, none were so intensely interested, and for a time so bewildered, as Mag Jessup. As she read very slowly in her Bible, and often reread the verses for the night, so as to make quite sure that she understood them as well as it was possible to understand without help, she had not yet reached Jacob's story, and the motto was therefore quite new to her. Still the words were plain enough. "Of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee." Mag had never studied arithmetic, and knew nothing about fractions. Still she had a fair share of what we call common sense, and, before many persons had spoken, she gathered that 1/10 meant a certain part of whatever one had. The idea of giving to God at all was entirely new to her. All her knowledge of him was connected with his giving to her. But it was a very pleasant thought. Her eyes shone over it. "It is just like a little girl making presents to her father," she said to herself. "She takes the money he gives her, and gets a present for him with it, because she loves him, and he likes to have her do it. How lovely in God to let people do so!" You will notice that little Mag had a strange way of thinking about God. It was because she had never been taught by any one how to speak. All her knowledge of God was learned from her one book, Little Pillows, and the few Bible verses she knew, and the few chapters she had read, and by prayer. The result was that she constantly thought of him in much the same way that she would of some strong, grand human friend. All through that beautiful meeting, the talking and the praying, and even the singing, had to do with the one subject, the tenth. The importance of it, the duty of it, the joy of it. until Mag, listening as, it is safe to say, no other person listened there that night, knew at the close much more than she had when she entered. A very short meeting it seemed to her. When at last they arose and sang, "God be with you till we meet again," sweet as the words were, and much as she wanted to read them all, her eyes kept burning with tears. She was so very, very sorry that it was all getting done. But then, when they bowed their heads and prayed this prayer, "The Lord watch between me and thee, when we are absent one from another," Mag was comforted. She had never heard that prayer before; she never forgot it. For the first time in her life she had felt herself prayed for. Between me and thee, what could that mean but the leader and each one present? And the leader at that time was the minister. Then the minister had prayed for her! Half a dozen people gathered about Frederick Ainsworth. "So glad to see you to night, Fred." "Good for you, Frederick. Come again." "Oh, Mr. Ainsworth, won't you be sure to come next Sunday night? It is our temperance meeting, and we want to have an extra good time." These were some of the greetings. Everybody seemed to know him. He bethought himself once, and, turning to look for Mag, said, "Helen, speak to the mouse that I have in charge. She is little Mag Jessup from our house." And then a bright-faced girl with merry eyes leaned toward her for a moment, and said carelessly, "How do you do? I am glad to see you," and turned at once back to Mr. Frederick, and did not know then, and perhaps never will know or imagine, what an opportunity she had to speak a few words of kindness to one of the Lord's own little ones. Not that she was not kind enough; she was simply careless. "I wonder what Fred Ainsworth thought I could say to that little Jessup girl," she said to her friend on the way home. "I know the little thing. She is errand girl at the Perkinses', the boarding house, you know. It was funny for Fred to bring her, wasn't it? But he is a real good natured boy. I never know what to say to girls like that." And then Miss Helen Westervelt, who had been one of the witnesses to the joy of giving a tenth to the Lord, thought no more about Mag Jessup. It would not have taken a 16th part of an hour to have spoken a word to Mag that might have helped her through all the rest of her life. Mr. Fred Ainsworth had to talk during the walk home. Mag was overflowing with questions that demanded replies of some sort. "Who is Jacob, Mr. Frederick?" "Jacob? I did not see any person to night by that name, so far as I know." "No, but the man they talked about, who made that promise. They called it his motto, Jacob's motto." "Oh, why, that is a Bible character. Jacob was, let me see, well, for one thing, he was Isaac's son." "Oh, is he?" said Mag, well pleased. "Then I shall get to him very soon. I know Isaac. But, Mr. Frederick, just what is a tenth?" "It is a tenth, of course," said Frederick, laughing. "You are not up on figures, are you? Never mind, some day you will have a chance to learn. Suppose you had 10 apples." Mag caught her breath over the thought of such wealth, but waited in eager silence. "And you should give one of them to me. Then you would have given me a tenth of all your apples. Do you understand?" "I thought that must be it," said Mag in intense satisfaction. "Then, Mr. Frederick, if I had $1, a whole dollar, and took Jacob's motto, I would give 10 cents of it to the Lord?" "That's it exactly. You are not a bad mathematician after all. How did you work that out?" "Mrs. Perkins gave me $1 once, and sent me to the store to get it changed into 10-cent pieces, and I counted them over a great many times to make sure that I had $1's worth. I thought of that when they were talking to night, and it seemed as though that must be what a tenth meant. I don't suppose I shall ever have $1, but once I had 10 cents of my very own. But, Mr. Frederick—" "Yes, I am all attention." "What if I should, sometime, have 10 cents again? How could I give a penny to God? I mean, how do people give money to him? He doesn't need any money; and if he did, how could we get it to him?" "What an ignorant little creature it is!" That was Fred Ainsworth's first thought. The second was, "What an ignorant hulk I am! How am I to explain to her what it means? Then he tried. Why, Mag, you know about missions, don't you? There are people who live away off in heathen lands where they don't know anything about God, and people in this country, for that matter, who are ignorant of him. Well, more than that, people who are hungry and cold and homeless. Certainly you know such?" "Oh, yes," said Mag. "There is Sally who comes every Monday for cold pieces, and who sometimes cries because her feet are so dreadfully cold." "Very well. And Mrs. Perkins fills her basket. Perhaps she gives away a tenth of her food, for all that I know. That is what it means." He was conscious that he was a poor teacher. Mag was silent, but if he could have seen her face he would have found great perplexity. After a minute she ventured a timid question. "But, Mr. Frederick, they talked about giving to God." "Well?" "And Mrs. Perkins only gives to Sally." "Ah, I see. Why, Mag, it amounts to the same thing. He counts it so, you understand. Hold on, there is a Bible verse I used to know that will explain it. 'Inasmuch as ye did it unto one of the least of these, ye did it to me.' That was what Jesus said, and by the least he meant the poorest and lowest and meanest, Sally and her tribe, for instance." Then is it a pity that he could not have seen Mag's face. It was radiant. "Did he truly say such words?" she murmured. "Does he love people like that?" There was silence for several minutes. Frederick Ainsworth felt that he had no reply to make to that last question. And, indeed, Mag's tone indicated that it needed no answer. She was evidently just exclaiming over the greatness of the thought. But she began again. "Mr. Frederick, I haven't a bit of money, nor anything to eat except what belongs to Mrs. Perkins, and she says I have no right to give it away, and of course I haven't. How could I give a tenth?" Mr. Frederick laughed a little. "A puzzling question, I will admit," he said. "I guess you would better wait until you get hold of something that belongs to you." "I was wondering, you know that girl told about giving a tenth of her time. I do have a little time every day that I suppose belongs to me. Sometimes when I sit in the hall and wait, you know, and often a little while in the evening. If there was only something that I could do then for God." Oh, the wistfulness of Mag's tone! "Couldn't you help me think of something, Mr. Frederick?" Frederick Ainsworth did not laugh, and he made no answer for several seconds. Then he said in a voice that sounded a trifle strange, "I'm afraid I'm not up in that kind of thing, Mag. You need a better teacher." Chapter 12